The men who founded the United States built their nation on the ideals of liberty and natural law. But to justify the reality of slavery, they claimed that the black people they enslaved were intellectually incapable of the very reason the Enlightenment celebrated. In 1761, that justification collided with a 7-year-old girl. She was kidnapped from her home in West Africa and forced into the crushing dark of a slave ship, surviving the Middle Passage with only the memory of her mother pouring out water in a morning ritual. When she arrived in Boston, John and Susanna Wheatley purchased her. They stripped away her African name and gave her a new one, Phillis, named after the ship that had trafficked her across the Atlantic. Legally, this child was classified as property, but her presence in the Wheatley home was about to challenge the very intellectual foundation the colonists used to justify her bondage. Curious, inside the Wheatley household, Phyllis's mind began to absorb information at a rate that baffled her enslavers. They eventually shifted her away from domestic labor to focus entirely on her education, allowing her to pursue a course of study few in the colonies could access. Within 16 months of her arrival, she was completely fluent in English. She then moved on to master Greek, Latin, and the most difficult passages of the Bible. By the age of 12, she wasn't just reading the classics, she was authoring her own neoclassical poetry. Her verses began to circulate among Boston's elite, creating a stir in a society that didn't believe her mind could exist. Her existence created a direct challenge to colonial law. She was a world-class intellect demonstrating the height of Enlightenment reason, yet she remained legally classified as livestock. At age 18, Phyllis compiled a manuscript of her poems, but local publishers refused to print it. They simply did not believe that an enslaved black teenager was capable of such sophisticated writing. To get her work published, she had to defend her own mind. In 1772, she was called before a panel of 18 of Boston's most powerful white men, including the colonial governor, to prove her authorship in person. She passed their examination, forcing the panel to draft a formal legal document. They put their names to a paper swearing to the public that an enslaved black woman was indeed the author of the manuscript. This signed attestation forced the local establishment to go on the record. 18 of Boston's most influential leaders, slave owners and scholars alike, were bound to their admission. An enslaved woman possessed the same intellectual capability as her captors. With Boston printers hesitating, she traveled to London in 1773. She saw her work in print, becoming an international figure. On this title page, the focus is on religious and moral subjects, the acceptable colonial themes that unlocked a literary world otherwise closed to her. But within those expected rhymes, she was hiding a sharp critique. She used biblical allusions and the language of natural rights to point out the contradiction of colonists who demanded freedom from England while keeping Africans in bondage. Her poetry functioned as a tool of political subversion. She took the Enlightenment's own logic of liberty and used it to interrogate the ethics of the men who held her captive. Despite her fame, her later life was defined by hardship. After she was freed and the Wheatleys died, she was left to navigate a deeply racist society alone, eventually dying in poverty at age 31. After her death, Thomas Jefferson tried to erase her achievement from the historical record. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he dismissed her work entirely, claiming her poems were below the dignity of criticism. Jefferson's attack was calculated. To acknowledge her genius was to admit that his entire justification for slavery was a lie. He had to invalidate her mind to protect the economic reality of his slave-owning society. But her work survived. Decades later, as the American abolitionist movement began to grow, activists returned to her poems. This engraving captures Wheatley in a pose of deep thought. It was used by 19th century activists as physical evidence of Black humanity, proving to a skeptical public that the capacity for genius was not limited by race. Today, she is recognized as the mother of the African American literary tradition, her voice reaching far beyond the obscurity of her final years. The girl who was renamed after the ship that carried her became the author of the poems that later generations would use to fight for their own freedom.